This is the true story behind the movie Stalking Laura and how she was stalked by a coworker for over 4 years.
This woman had her face ripped off by a chimpanzee.
The first sign that pointed to Alicia missing was when she racked up 30 absences from school.
This is the true story behind the movie Stalking Laura and how she was stalked by a coworker for over 4 years. Laura Black was 22 years old when she made the move from Virginia all the way to Sunnyvale, California in April of 1984. She had just landed her dream job as an engineer at a high-tech defense contractor called ESL. On her first day of work, she was given a tour of the building and was introduced to all of her new coworkers. This is when she met a man named Richard Wade Farley. He was a computer technician and had been working at ESL for over 9 years. His coworkers described him as quiet and shy, and they say he was just generally a nice guy. So Laura introduces herself to Richard and then just goes about her day, not really thinking anything else about him. But for Richard, it was a complete opposite. He says that the moment he met Laura, he immediately fell in love with her. A few days after settling into her new job, Laura went out to eat with a coworker and with Richard. This was a friendly lunch, everyone paid for their own meal, and that was it. That was the only time that Laura Black had ever hung out with Richard Farley. Laura ends up joining a health club, and one time when she was at her aerobics class, Richard randomly showed up. And Laura never told Richard what health club she joined, so this means that after she got off work, Richard literally followed her and learned her routine. After this, Richard asked Laura out on a date, and of course she said no to him because Richard just couldn't take no for an answer. He began leaving gifts and cards on her desk. One time Laura walked into her office at work, and Richard was already inside just waiting for her with some homemade bread that he wanted to gift her. He also stopped by her desk numerous times a day, and he would call her work phone just to ask her what she was doing. Now somehow through the HR department at ESL, Richard managed to gain access to Laura's personal information, which helped him obtain her home address and her home phone number. So now, instead of just harassing her at work, he also began to harass her at her own home. He would circle around her house, he would park his car across the street and just stare at her. He also would just sit outside for hours trying to break into her garage. Of course, anytime Laura saw him doing this, she immediately told him to leave. But Richard just didn't care. He continued to show up to her house, he continued to try to break in, and he also began calling her on her home phone number. He would call her on the phone to ask her what she was doing, and he would call her to ask her out on dates. Honestly, he was so delusional, he would call Laura and be like, listen, I'm going to stop by your house at 8 p.m. to pick you up for a date. And of course, Laura would never call him back, she would never confirm this date, she would never talk to him, nothing. Even though he never even heard back from Laura, he would still show up to her house at 8 p.m. ready for the date. Laura would tell him to leave, and he would just laugh about it and not really take her seriously. This stalking went on for 4 years. Laura moved numerous times, she changed her phone number, and every single time she did this, Richard found out her new address. Now, Laura did report him to the HR department numerous times. They issued him warning letters, they sent him to psychological counseling, they told him to stop doing this, and he just didn't care. They also told them that if he was fired, he would have nothing to live for and he would kill himself and others. Even after making these threats, they still let him work there. It wasn't until May of 1986 that Richard was fired from ESL. Okay, go to part 2. This is part 2 on the true story behind the movie Stalking Laura and how she was stalked by a coworker for 4 years. Now Richard is fired from ESL and he's angry. He ends up getting a new job, he ends up getting a girlfriend, and yet he continues to stalk Laura. He continued to show up to her apartment, he would show up to her workout classes, and he began parking his car in the ESL parking lot, just waiting for Laura to come out. He began leaving her notes and packages on her car, and inside the package he would leave her a copy of her current house key, basically letting her know that he could get to her at any time. Laura finally had enough, and in February of 1988, she filed for a temporary restraining order against Richard. Laura says that she was afraid of what Richard might do if she filed this TRO, but she also knew that it needed to happen. And in order to make the TRO permanent, a court date was set for February 17th. Within these 2 weeks, Richard purchased a handful of weapons and ammunition. And the day before the court date, on Tuesday, February 16, 1988, Richard walked into the ESL building loaded with weapons and ammunition. He began making his way to Laura's office, which was located on the 2nd floor, and was shooting at anybody in his way. After a few minutes, he finally reached Laura's office, and she slammed the door in his face, trying to hide. So Richard shot through the door, and the bullet barely missed Laura. Then he shot at her again and hit her in her shoulder. He actually knocked her unconscious on the floor. After this, he left Laura's office and continued on with his rampage. The reason he left her there is because he says he didn't intend to kill her. He wanted her to live so that she could know that he wasn't joking around and that she should have taken him seriously. After a few hours, Laura woke up and was trying to stop her wound from bleeding. She found a couple of other employees who were also hiding, and they managed to make their way to the parking lot, which by this point was already filled with ambulances and police. And this is an actual photo of Laura and one of her coworkers running outside and trying to hide. It took 5 hours for Richard to finally surrender, and his one condition was that he receive a number 26 sandwich from the restaurant Togo's and a Diet Pepsi. Overall, Richard killed 7 people and injured 4. The victims were 43-year-old Joe Silva, 23-year-old Wayne Williams, 27-year-old Glenda Moritz, 26-year-old Ron Reed, 49-year-old Helen Lamparter, 46-year-old Lawrence Kane, and 36-year-old Ron Downey. Now, I don't know if they said this because in the moment they were upset because they had just lost their loved ones, but a lot of the victims' families blame Laura. I feel like it's wrong to blame Laura because what else could she have done? She moved multiple times, she changed her phone number, she reported it to HR, and they still let him work there. She also called the police and she filed for a temporary restraining order, and he still did this. One of the judges on the case actually said, "Pieces of paper do not stop bullets." I mean, Richard didn't even care that he got fired. He didn't care that he had a temporary restraining order against him. Like, he was unhinged. Now, because of what happened to Laura Black, California passed the first ever anti-stalking law in America. Richard was sentenced to death and still remains on death row today. As for the movie, Laura Black said that she did help with the writing because she wanted to tell her story in her own way. Definitely makes you realize that stalking should never be taken lightly.
Do not watch this video unless you have a very strong stomach. This woman had her face ripped off by a chimpanzee. Just a warning, if animal cases upset you, do not watch this one. In 2009 in Connecticut, Sandra Herold makes a horrifying call to police. Screams can be heard in the background as Sandra explains to officers that her friend is being ripped apart by her chimpanzee. Sandra is literally screaming at the officers and they actually seem to think that it's a joke, it's a hoax call. So rewinding prior to this day, Sandra has a pet chimp called Travis. Travis had been raised by Sandra and her husband, and he was just like a son to them. Sandra's husband sadly passed away. It made her and Travis even closer. However, Travis was growing bigger and stronger by the day, and Sandra was struggling to cope. Travis was becoming more and more disobedient, and Sandra had a friend, Charla, who would actually pop over and help sometimes. Charla had known Travis since he was a baby, so they were very familiar with each other. The day in question, however, Charla had apparently changed her hairstyle, which may have confused Travis. She was trying to get him back in his cage using his favourite toy, but unfortunately Travis launched at her. He started to savagely attack her, and in an attempt to try and save her friend's life, Sandra had to attack Travis back. She later told people how traumatic this was for her, to have to attack her chimp who she felt like was a son to her. In Sandra's call to police, she was actually telling police she thought that her friend was dead. She said that he literally ripped her apart, and honestly, the pictures are absolutely horrific. When police got to the scene, they had no choice but to shoot Travis, and they also managed to get medical attention for Charla. Thankfully, they saved her life, but she has had to have extensive medical surgery. She's obviously had to undergo a lot of counselling as well, and she's even lost nearly both of her hands. Personally, I feel like this is the exact reason that the laws in the US should be the same as the UK, where it's illegal to own dangerous wild animals. This is the UK's most famous missing boy. In September 2007, Andrew Gosden was just 14 years old. He was a very intelligent boy and was top of his class in most classes at school. He was an introvert that usually spent most of his time at home. The day before Andrew went missing seemed completely normal. He went to school, he had some tea, and then he watched some TV. However, on September the 14th, he seemed more irritable than normal. Instead of getting the bus to school that morning like his parents thought he was, he went to a cash point and withdrew £200. CCTV then captures him walking home, where he changed his clothes into a Slipknot t-shirt. When he left the house, he didn't take his charger with him, and he also didn't take £100 that he'd saved up. He didn't take his passport, but he did take his house key, which indicates he was going to come home. He bought a one-way ticket to London and was last seen leaving King's Cross station at about 11:30. Frustratingly, the school had actually tried to contact Andrew's parents to say that he hadn't turned up to school that day, but they dialed the wrong number and left an answer phone message on the wrong phone. His family was completely cleared of any suspicion, and the family and the school and all of the students went to London and they were handing out loads of flyers. Weirdly, a year after this incident, a man came to a police station to say that he had information about Andrew. Now, the police station was unmanned, so the person spoke to this man just over an intercom system and sent a police officer down there. Mysteriously, by the time the police officer arrived, the person had vanished. This is what Andrew might look like now, just being the age that he may be if he's still alive. Theories about this case is that he may have gone to London to meet up with someone or go to a concert. Was he lured there by somebody with bad intentions, or was he just going there for the day, gonna come back, and was at the wrong place at the wrong time and somebody did something bad to him? In 2009, the family paid for a search of the River Thames to try and find some sort of closure. The search did find a body, but it wasn't Andrew's. The most up-to-date information that we have on this case is that 2 men were arrested on suspicion of kidnapping Andrew, but they've actually been released.
In 2014, 8-year-old Relisha Rudd was living at DC General Shelter with her mother Shamika Young. The first sign that pointed to Relisha missing was when she racked up 30 absences from school. However, the school was given a note from her mother saying that she was with Dr. Tatum. Dr. Tatum refers to Khalil Tatum. He was a custodian at the homeless shelter at the same time that Relisha lived there. The 51-year-old had a very concerning track record. Legally, he was a convicted felon. But around the shelter, he was known to pay attention to the young girls who lived there, and Relisha was someone who he took an interest in. During the investigation, police discovered surveillance tapes that put the spotlight directly on Tatum. He was seen with Relisha at 2 different hotels during the time in which she was missing. Police immediately began searching for Tatum, but found that he had killed himself. The gun that he used was a match for the one that killed his wife weeks earlier. To this day, Relisha Rudd is still considered missing.